everyone. Welcome once again to the Fellowship League. I'm yours truly, Carla Bud, and we would like to greet you a happy good evening, good morning, and good afternoon to you all, wherever you are around the world. For those who don't know me, my name is Carla Bud. Again, I said my name twice. I love it. Love my name so much. I'm currently taking up history at the Polytechnic University of the Philippines here in Manila, and I'm currently an active member of the of CCF, Christ Commission Fellowship, headed by Pastor Peter Tanchi. And in particular, I'm also an active member of the youth movement there called Elevate, headed by Pastor Marty Ocaya. And it's always been my passion to study apologetics, Christian apologetics in particular. And I'm looking forward to study apologetics through the lens of history. I love history. And so far, right now, I'm planning to allot this time because after, I'm sure if you watched already last week's segment with Mr. Andres on the topic on reaching out to the secular 21st century, insights from a former atheist turned Christian. Right now, I wanted to allot this time more to study somehow the intellectual side of things, more of like, at the same time, application. So on how to do particularly Christian apologetics through the lens of history. And I've always wanted to do this segment because among all the interviews we've only had one interview, which is we tackled on the topic on relieving Christianity in the early church. So right now we're trying to. I wanted to broaden those things, broaden this discipline, so that I'm not sure. Hopefully, you viewers would be. I'm sure history. What's the first thing comes in your mind when you hear the word history? It's so boring. You always read, but actually, it's exciting. It's the story about humanity. It's a story about us. So that's why we wanted to allot this segment. And this topic we're going to tackle right now is on the topic of how to do Christian apologetics and history in the 21st century. And I'm going to introduce right now our wonderful, amazing guest, Dr. Mike Licona. Well, I'll read his biography first. Dr. Mike has a Ph.D. in New Testament from the University of Pretoria. He completed all requirements with distinction and the highest marks. He is a frequent speaker on university campuses, churches, Christian groups, retreats, frequently debates, and has appeared as a guest on dozens of radio and television programs. He is a member of the Evangelical, Theological, and Philosophical Societies, an Institute for Biblical Research, the Society of Biblical Literature, and the prestigious Studitorum Novi Testamenti Societas. Dr. Mike is currently an associate professor in theology at Houston Baptist University and the president of the Recent Jesus website, which is an online website ministry of Dr. Mike here. And he's currently married to Debbie, and they have two children, grown children, Alexandra and Zachary. And by the way, a little bit, he's well known. He's a well-known author. He's the one who co-authored with Dr. Gary Habermas. The book is entitled The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus. I would love to have that book someday, which is the book which gives a comprehensive study course. And also other books like Behold, I Stand at the Door and Knock, which lays out in a concise manner what to say to Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses when they knock on your door. Also, why are there differences in the Gospels? What we can learn from ancient biography, published in Oxford 2017. So without any further ado, I want to welcome Dr. Mike Licona. How are you, Dr. Mike?
Good, Carl. Thanks for having me, and it's nice to be with you. And love all you folks in the Philippines, and very glad to see what you're doing over there. And I'm thrilled to hear about your interest in historical studies and applying those to Christian apologetics. We need good Christian historians for apologetics and who will do their work with integrity.
Yes, absolutely, Dr. Mike. And history has always been one of my favorite ever since I started high school. And usual topics. You get a book, you read the timelines, periodizations, and all these things. Suddenly, I became a Christian. I got interested in the Christian faith, and that's how I got to learn history, and then later on apologetics. And before we proceed to the questions, I'm sure we have a difference in status here in terms of the weather, because over here it's evening in the Philippines. Over there it's morning. right,
That's
Dr. Mike?
correct. It's a little after 10 a.m. in the morning, and it's quite late there in the evening there in the Philippines.
Oh yes, it's 10:13 p.m. right in the Philippines, and I'm still hyped up. And I have my hot choke, and I have my hot choco here. Yay! To keep me
That'll keep you
awake.
going.
Yes. Dr. Mike, of course, the viewers would want to know, how did you come to be interested in Christian apologetics? And it's okay along the lines there. It's okay if you share also. How did you get interested in history? It's very interesting. Did you feel God calling you to this kind of ministry?
That's a good question, Carl. Did I feel God calling me to it? I mean, okay, so I'd say I've been a Christian since age 10. I'm 59 now. So for almost 50 years. So for 49 years, I've been a Christian. And I can say during that time, I've probably felt that God was speaking to me in a very real sense. It wasn't that I heard his voice, but it was like, in each case, it was like I heard the words in my mind with crystal clarity, and I can't explain it. I just knew that God was speaking to me at that point. So probably just a handful of times like that. This was not one of them, a call to Christian apologetics. So what is a call? Is it God speaking? For me, it was just such an intense, passionate desire to be involved in this kind of ministry that I just couldn't do anything else. If that's what we constitute a call, and I think we can, Paul talks in Timothy about, whoever desires to be an overseer, a pastor, is desirous of a noble thing. So it doesn't talk about call in the sense of God speaking, but so just to clarify that. Now, what got me interested? I think I first started by learning how to answer and wanting to learn how to answer the Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses who came to my door. And I don't know what it's like over in the Philippines, but here in the United States, you can be expected to be visited by 2 Mormon missionaries or 2 Jehovah's Witnesses who come to your door and want to share their views with you. You can expect them to see them, if not every year, very frequently or a number of times during your lifetime. So I spent time, when I was in grad school, the Jehovah's Witnesses would come up and they'd talk about how, Jesus is not God. He's not the Son of God in the sense of a Trinity. And, they give certain verses for that. So at that time in graduate school, I was learning Greek. And I was seeing that the way that they were interpreting those texts were just mistaken. And so it was learning how to respond to Jehovah's Witnesses, learning how to respond and answer Mormons that got me interested in defending the faith, but it was against cults. And I ended up writing a book in 1998, Behold, I Stand at the Door and Knock. You mentioned it. What to Say to Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses When They Knock on Your Door. It's now out of print, but you can get it, download it for free as a PDF from my website, risenjesus.com. It's a free PDF. And a lot of people have said how helpful that has been to them. So it's free. You don't have to sign up or do anything. You just go to my website and find it in the resources under books, and you can download it for free. So then after that, once I finished grad school and went back home, I found myself, and my grad work was in New Testament studies. I found myself encountering, atheists and skeptics, and I'd get in conversations with them. And to be honest with you, Carl, I had no interest in Christian apologetics up until that time. I had roommates who were doing master's degrees in Christian apologetics, and they talk about David Hume, and I'd be thinking, well, but David Hume, who was he? Well, he was the Scottish skeptic of the 18th century. Well, I mean, aren't you a little bit almost 3 centuries late to the game? Why are you just getting around to this now? I didn't understand the need for it until I needed it. And when I left grad school and I started to, which was a Christian university, and then I started to share my faith with non-believers and come in contact with atheists and agnostics, and they were bringing up things to which I didn't know the answer. All of a sudden now I realized I needed it. And then I started, at some points I was questioning my faith and started to have doubts, and now I needed apologetics. And so that's what got me involved. That's what got me interested in apologetics.
Wow, Dr. Mike. I mean, it's a very common thread, you know. I mean, we get interested in apologetics and we get interested in these topics because other people have entered into our lives and ask us and even bring out their arguments, you know, whether it's for the existence of God or against the existence of God. I mean, I can relate to what you said, Dr. Mike, because in my case, when I although I'm still young, I'm 20, I'm 20, I'm only 20 years old, but
Well, you're way ahead of where I was at 20, Carl. So
oh
good for you, man.
yes, and I encountered an atheist friend of mine when I was in my basically junior high school. I was my ninth grade, grade 9. That was 2014, and it was my first time to enter this secular culture kind of school. And then suddenly I had this friend of mine who's vocal with communism, and that's my first time to hear that word: communism, evolution, Darwin, morality, and it devastated my faith. And to cut the story short, it just made me it fueled me. It made me click, and it made me search more, you know, research more, and read more books. And with that, I got interested also with apologetics. And in your case, Dr. Mike, you've encountered Mormons, you've encountered Jehovah's Witness knocking at your door. Well, here in the Philippines, Dr. Mike, since I was born, I think we've never had anyone knocking at our door here.
Wow.
Yes, because here in the Philippines, we're majority Catholic, or rather Christian in population. So there's not much. Well, there are Mormon temples nearby here, and there are also some people also doing those routines. But majority, in my experience, I never encountered talking to them. I've encountered talking to an INC, you know, Iglesia ni Cristo, which is a very famous, call this different, rather part or denomination of Christianity, and also Muslims and different religious people. So I mean,
You know, it's interesting you mentioned the Iglesia ni Cristo. I should have thought about that, you being in the Philippines. My first, you could almost call it a debate. I guess you could. You know, I typically don't think of this as one of my debates because it was just small. It was in a house, and there was someone I had bumped into, and they asked me if I would debate a pastor, a leader of an Iglesia ni Cristo. And so I agreed. And so they filled this house. I don't know how many people there were, maybe 20. And, you know, we talked about certain texts, and, you know, we focused on who is Jesus. And of course, they take a position somewhat similar to Jehovah's Witnesses, saying that Jesus was not God, and appealed to many of the same verses. So, you know, I was already pretty equipped for that. So that was almost, you could almost say that was my first debate against a leader of an Iglesia ni Cristo church.
Well, I believe, wow, I mean, that really fueled you a lot. I mean, you experienced all the lenses there in Christianity. That's that's a challenge for the church nowadays, I believe, Dr. Mike. I mean, we're so into this, you know, everyday life. We're in screen first before anything else kind of culture, where you swap and swipe more of your stuff on your on the screen of your smartphone, and then whatever you just absorb, you know, and just sit down on the couch and do nothing. Especially in this time, you know, in pandemic. I mean, what should we do? And I believe, Dr. Mike, I was actually, I'm inspired by what you just shared there, Dr. Mike, because you've encountered many of these people, and which actually is a great help. I believe many Christians should also be willing to be open to these worldviews, and in my case, I believe that because I come from I'm currently a history student, and when you're an historian, you always need to open your mind. You have to look at all the sources there, yeah, right? But we'll talk more about that as we go on. But Dr. Mike, I just want to ask you this question for starters, maybe for the viewers who are watching us right now. Hello, viewers. Hope this will not be too deep for you all. But please, we encourage you guys to, if you have any questions, you can ask. Just leave us a message, leave us a comment there below this video. and or send us a private message if you want. But Dr. Mike, I want to ask you, what is apologetics? How important is apologetics right now in the 21st century? Like, come on, like it's 2000 years already after Christ, and a lot of cultures have been changing, and we're now in a different time. I mean, it's okay if you define it for us and also
Yeah.
expound also in how relevant it is.
Well, apologetics comes from the Greek term apologia. It's used a few times in the New Testament. The one most commonly appealed to is 1 Peter 3:15, sanctify, set apart Christ as Lord in your hearts, always being ready to make a defense to everyone who asks you to give an account of the hope that is in you. And the term used there is apologion, a defense. And that's usually referring to a rational presentation of why. Doesn't necessarily mean Christian apologetics in a formal sense. I mean, apologetics could involve just giving one's testimony in the sense of the term of what it means in Greek. Why you've become a Christian. You should be willing to give reasons why you are a Christian. But it later on, to become an apologist meant to defend. And in English, you get the word apology. And apology, it's changed in its meaning. Apology originally meant to just give a reason for your action, okay? But it has morphed in now to mean, well, I did this and I'm sorry for doing it.
Right.
But that's what apologetics is. It's given a reason why you are a Christian, why you think Christianity is true. And it's typically arguments that go philosophical arguments, scientific arguments, moral arguments, historical arguments, why we believe Christianity is true. And it's important in the 21st century. I mean, it's always been important, but it's very important now because many cultures, at least in the West, have become increasingly secular. And now they're not only secular like here and in Europe, and in Scandinavia, but they've become increasingly hostile to the Christian position. That to hold such positions as biblical morality becomes something for which you can be persecuted. Even though there have been Christian, the West has been founded today, at least the West as we have today, has been founded on the Judeo-Christian ethic. It's not so much now. The West has gone away from that, and it's becoming more and more difficult to practice one's faith, to do so with integrity in the West. So we need, I think it was C.S. Lewis, I might be wrong on that, but I think it's C.S. Lewis who said that good philosophy must be given to keep, if nothing else, to answer bad philosophy. And there's a lot of bad philosophy out there going today, and we need to be showing that Christianity is true. You should be a Christian, not because it's fun to be a Christian or whatever, but because it's true. And if it is true, there is a God to answer to when one dies. So, and if you want to flourish in your life, no matter what the circumstances, if you want to be able to flourish, at least in your relationship with God, what's ultimately important, then you need to be a Christian.
I completely agree with that, Dr. Mike, because, I've had many of this, a lot of things hearing from different Christian friends of mine who are asking help on how to answer these questions. And until today, it's still relevant today, especially in this time of crisis, wherein people are asking more emotional questions than intellectual ones. And I believe apologetics, as what you said, sir, which is defending or giving a reason for defense, not actually just apologizing like I'm sorry, is qualified to in that level of discourse, wherein you have to be willing to be brave and courageous in helping people, and which is not only within the Christian community, which is actually open. Dr. Mike, I that's what I appreciate so much with apologetics, because people tend to compartmentalize disciplines. Like, okay, I'm in science, I just stick with science. Science is the only answer. I stick with the philosophy, no. But actually, in fact, all of them are interconnected. And that's what apologetics, I believe, also teaches us, that we cannot have history without philosophy. And also science. We cannot have science without philosophy. Without philosophy, there would be no these disciplines. So this made me open my mind clearly to ideas, and which is good. Well, there are other people who don't need arguments; they just need storytelling. But that's also part of the whole thing.
Well, yeah, and that's what we would call cultural apologetics, right? So
yes.
for me, I haven't had much interest in cultural apologetics. I'd like more the biblical, philosophical side, because that's just the way I think. But with today's culture, the millennials and so forth, they're more of a feeling oriented.
Yes.
You know, they're not so much concerned with facts, which is bad on their part. That's bad. Because then you're governed more by feelings than you are by fact, and that's just a bad way to live and can have tragic consequences for one's future. But you have to reach people where they are, and a lot of times those who are really emotions and feelings oriented aren't going to respond to so much to logical arguments. And so cultural apologetics, that which is done by people like Nancy Pearcey, Ravi Zacharias, C.S. Lewis, and people who are creating movies that illustrate these kinds of things. And Christian movie making is getting much better. Not quite there yet,
Yes.
but they're getting much, much, much better than they were just 10 years ago. The quality of a lot of Christian filmmaking. So that needs to be done in order to reach people who are feeling rather than fact-oriented, or rather than intellectually motivated in that sense. So I'm glad for both. The body and community of Christian apologetics needs both. They need both the philosophical, biblical, and they need cultural apologetics. That doesn't mean you have to do both, but there need to be Christian apologists in both of those ways.
Yes, I remember I interviewed Sir Max Jagannathan, who is one of the regional directors of RZM Asia Pacific, and he cited, I'm not sure, he got this from a certain saying. He said, "It's all okay. Don't believe everything you feel, but I believe it's also equally bad that you don't believe everything you think."
Yeah.
So yeah, so it's I agree with what you said. Cultural apologetics, and it's just basically the mind and the heart in balance. And I believe that's one of the greatest challenges of the church until today for 2,000 years. Not to mention the Protestant Reformation, not to mention the corruption of the Catholic Church. Sorry to say that, but it's true. But and the branching out of different Christianities into different denominations. Now, Dr. Mike, with the idea that if you're a Christian, you're also a scholar. Now, I believe that. I believe every Christian ought to be scholars. What is history then?
Well, there's many different definitions that's offered by historians on what history is. Some would say history is what you reconstruct the past, your reconstruction of the past. It's not the past itself. So is it a description of the past? Is it what we can learn about the past? Richard Rorty, who died a few years ago, who was a postmodernist, he said, history is what you can convince your colleagues to believe about the past. So anyway, many different definitions of history. I take history to be, it's the study of the past. And when I say something is a historical fact, it's something that I can establish with reasonable certainty that this is what happened. This is what it was like in the past, this particular item. And history, when we reconstruct the past, it's not going to be exhaustive, of course, and we're not going to be entirely certain about whether our conclusions are correct. We're looking for reasonable certainty. The only way to gain certainty would be to get into a time machine, return to the past in order to verify our conclusions, and we can't do that. But of course, we're in the same position as a lot of other disciplines like geologists, archaeologists, evolutionary biologists, and even cosmologists to a large extent. Even though cosmologists or astrophysicists deal a lot more with mathematics. Physics itself. I remember having a conversation with a couple of physicists and philosophers, two physicists at MIT and a philosopher of science at Harvard. And we were talking about these things, and I said to them, so what do you guys use in physics? I understand yours is like the most certain, you can get the most certain conclusions because you're largely based on mathematics. And what criteria do you use prior to arriving at certain conclusions? And the guy really shocked me. His answer shocked me. He said, well, we really don't have any. And even though a lot of our conclusions are certain, or we have a lot of confidence in them because they are based on mathematics, a lot of things that we believe right now are going to be discarded a few years from now. So, and he says this has been constant in physics. So it's that way not only in history, it's that way in virtually every discipline.
Exactly. I mean, Dr. Mike, I mean, that's a surprising, not only it applies to history, but also things change. But in other disciplines also, things, those information changes in other disciplines. But Dr. Mike, how can historians, how can those people, those students who are studying history, what is the method? What is the means to know that this document is authentic, that this is a really historical fact? How can a person determine that fact, that veracity of a document?
Well, there's a lot of different ways of doing that. And, are we talking about the authorship of the document, the way, like if we're talking about the authorship of the Gospels or the authorship of Plutarch's Lives or anything like that, the means to discovering that are going to be different from saying, how do we know that Caesar crossed the Rubicon? What criteria are we going to use? How are we going to assess documents? And even so, there's no criteria or method for any of those that is accepted across the board by everyone. So, I mean, this just becomes a problem. This becomes a challenge that, there's no method that is accepted across the board by every historian, and this is how we do things. So put in a different way, as many historians have said, there are no canons of history. There are no canons or principles that are accepted by everyone in terms of historians or biblical scholars. So even in biblical historical Jesus studies, a lot of us, perhaps most of us, would use what are called the criteria of authenticity. These are common sense criteria, such as, was it written by an eyewitness or someone who knew an eyewitness, or was it early? Is it likewise attested by an unsympathetic source? Does the source make a claim that would have been potentially embarrassing and discrediting to itself, and therefore we wouldn't expect them to have made this up? Like someone who goes in and applies for a job, and is there any information that we need to know about you? Have you ever been convicted of a felony? If the person says yes, well, you could probably trust them on that, because that's something that would be damaging to their own reputation. So something that is embarrassing in the report would have been embarrassing at the time to that person, has a better chance than not of being true. Or is it attested by multiple independent sources? Well, then there is a growing number of historians of Jesus, New Testament scholars, who are calling those criteria into question today. And the number of scholars doing that is gaining. And there's some good scholars that are doing it. I just don't find their arguments compelling. And something, I've in an essay in a book that came out last year, co-edited by Daryl Bach and Ed Kamaszewski, I contributed an essay in there and said, look, if you don't like these, do you think Jesus was crucified? And that's a historical event that is virtually undisputed in the world of historical Jesus scholars. And I'd say, well, if you think that he was crucified in the first century, how are you arriving at this conclusion, if not by these criteria of multiple independent sources, early sources, unsympathetic sources? So my point is that there's no method accepted by all scholars. And, we can talk about a specific thing if you want to dive into it, but there's different ways of, like, if you want to look at a particular saying or deed of Jesus reported in the Gospels, you would use a certain method, like the criteria of authenticity I just discussed. But if you were looking to compare whether the hallucination hypothesis or the disciples stole the body and lied about it, or Jesus rose from the dead, and you're comparing those three hypotheses, well, now you're going to apply different criteria, such as explanatory scope, which hypothesis best explains the data, explanatory power, given the truth of a hypothesis, what kind of things do we expect, and do we get those things? And the one that get what we would expect given the truth of the hypothesis, the one that gives us most, is probably what occurred. And you look at plausibility, and which is less ad hoc, and things like that. So you're using a different sort of criteria.
Interesting. Yes. So there are diverse methods that historians use, and in doing hypothesis, it does not. You cannot really say. We all cannot really say that this hypothesis is true. I mean, it develops over time as well. And in order
with
to
100% certainty, of course, we can't say it.
Yes, 100%. But would you also grant, Dr. Mike, the common methodology, like the internal and external criticisms? Because that's always been, I believe that's always been taught in the schools, in the universities, wherein when you look at document external criticism, you look at the date, when was it written, who wrote it, and then you compare it to other documents. And then the internal criticism, what can you say about the author? What's the reason why he wrote it? What's the reason why he wrote this document? I believe that's also one, I would say.
Sure, that's stuff that's involved in what we call higher criticism of the New Testament. And yeah, those things are important, and those are questions we all ask when it comes to something like who wrote the Gospel of Mark, who wrote the Gospel of John, things like that. Problem is, of course, they're going to be, scholars come to different answers. I'm more optimistic about, let's say, the authorship of Mark than a lot of scholars are. Now, today I have a student. I'll be talking with him and on a video pretty soon about some prolegomena in Mark's Gospel, like who wrote Mark, where scholarship is on this, and things like this. So he gives all the arguments for Mark and authorship, all the arguments against it, and all this kind of stuff. So yeah, I'm more optimistic, positive about the authorship of Mark. Yeah, there are some problems with some of the evidence supporting the authorship of Mark, but if you allow those problems to cast doubt on whether the traditional authorship of Mark, well, of course you can allow it to cast doubts, but if you do so to the extent that you say Mark did not write Mark, and that the Gospel of Mark is not largely based on what Peter had told Mark, well, if you're going to be consistent, you're going to throw out the authorship of Plutarch's lives and say, well, Plutarch probably didn't write them. That Sallust probably didn't write the war with Catiline and the war with Jugurtha and his histories. And you're going to have to throw out a lot of those things because the evidence we have for the authorship of Mark is superior to what we have to some of the major classical literature, which is virtually undisputed by classicists.
And you mentioned the authorship of the Gospels, and I believe I'm sure we all know of the famous skeptic Bart Ehrman, right? And I believe he says those arguments wherein it's not actually Mark and Matthew and they themselves wrote it. It could be they got it from different varieties of sources, and they even categorize them in different letters. The Q's. I forgot those letters. What can you say about that? I just want to hear your thoughts on that, sir.
Yeah, well, I think Bart is far too skeptical. He'll say that most scholars today don't think that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John wrote the Gospels, and that's just simply false. My grad student found that he looked at well over 200 critical scholars writing in English since 1965. That's wow. It's not exhaustive, but it's a very robust sampling. And he found that a majority of scholars That's not 75% or more, but 51% is a majority. It's more than 51%. I don't know what the actual number is, but the majority of critical scholars now who are writing on these things, that means they're not writing a devotional and things like that. They're writing and dealing with the pro and con arguments for who wrote Mark and where he got his information from. And the majority of critical scholars since 1965 writing in English think the traditional authorship of the Gospel of Mark is correct, and that Mark's primary source was Peter. That's what the majority are saying today of critical scholars. And he's done bean counting and put them in categories and so forth. According to Craig Keener, he says the majority of critical scholars regarding John's Gospel, they do not think that John, the son of Zebedee, wrote that Gospel. The majority of critical scholars do not accept the traditional authorship of John. Nevertheless, they do think that whoever wrote John, their primary source was one of Jesus's minor disciples. So you still have something that's different from the way Ehrman and other skeptics like to present this, to say, well, you had these stories and they were passed along word of mouth from person to person to person in an uncontrolled manner. And it's only after several decades that the form that story had taken, that found itself in the Gospels. That goes against what scholarship is actually saying today. Keener has also written on Luke Acts. He's got 4 huge commentaries on the book of Acts. And he says the majority of today's scholars, slight majority, do think that Luke got a lot of his information from Paul. He was a traveling companion of Paul. Now, a lot of times people like Ehrman will say, no, that's impossible. He wasn't this, and he'll give some arguments. But those arguments have been answered by a lot of scholars. And in fact, the majority of scholars, according to Keener, say that the author of Luke Acts was a traveling companion of Paul and got a lot of his information from eyewitnesses and or those who knew the eyewitnesses. So that's where the most difficult one is Matthew. And, we could go in more into depth with that. I personally think that Matthew was involved in the composition of that gospel, but maybe not to the same extent that Mark and Luke were involved in the composition of their gospels. But I do think that Matthew played a large part in the composition of that gospel. Perhaps he may have even oversaw it. So I'm more optimistic about that based on the evidence we have. I don't think we can be certain about the authorship of any of the 4 gospels. However, we can't be certain about the authorship of virtually any other ancient literature as well. The Gospels, the authorship of the Gospels is in a better position than much of the ancient classical literature is.
Wow, so it simply means, if we boil it down one statement, it is not completely certain that we can determine the authors of the Gospels, but we cannot also be 100% certain that there is no author of the Gospels.
You're right. There were some authors.
So there are always going to be authors there, and it has high probability, as what you said. The data that you presented, sir, is there is data that shows that the authors could have been one of the minor disciples of Jesus and would have known Jesus and would have also witnessed the Jesus himself of history. So, I mean, in relation to the historical Jesus, sir, I want to know how is in relation to what you said about history in general, right? How is it important? How important is historical work pertaining to Jesus in the 21st century?
Well, I think it's really important because today, I can only speak for the U.S. and Europe in the sense. I can't speak for the Philippines since I'm not so familiar with their situation. But maybe 100 years ago, to say the Bible says it, would have been held in a whole lot higher regard than it is today. It is not held in regard at all. In fact, in our culture in the U.S. today, some might say it's a Christian culture, but it is not. It's far from it today. So when you have people that are saying that Scripture should be rejected, it's racist, it's misogynist, You've got an evil God, and things like this, like that, like what Richard Dawkins would say. And this gains a lot of steam, a lot of momentum amongst non-believers, and they become iconoclasts. An iconoclast would be someone who is trying to tear down a traditional thing. So it's the exact opposite, the antithesis of an evangelist. An evangelist is bringing good news to try to persuade to embrace something. An iconoclast is trying to knock something down to persuade to not follow that thing. So you've got a lot of iconoclasts today. And so by providing historical arguments, why we can trust the Gospels about Jesus and his resurrection and things like this is really important for providing counter arguments to those arguments of the skeptics, the iconoclasts out there.
Iconoclasts.
It's a cultural war. I mean, it is a real cultural war, and we need not sit by and just let the iconoclasts go unchecked. We've got really good arguments. We have superior arguments, superior evidence, and we should use that.
Exactly, Dr. Mike. What puzzles me, sir? I mean, people are they don't see the evidence, but it's already there. I mean, the facts are already there. All they have to do is to just look at it, and you can see that these facts speak for themselves. And the historian without the facts is nothing. Facts without the historian is nothing as well. But it is something that when we interpret it in the right way, of course, we will reach the truth. Right? I'm sure we all agree with Aristotle, but he said, "No, you just follow where the evidence leads." And I'm sure whatever evidence is being presented to you along your journey, it will be there if only you're willing, if you're committed, if you're open to this data.
If you're open. A lot of people today don't care about the truth, though. They care about their own agendas. They care about what they feel and what they want. They don't want to have to submit to a God and put him first and say, "Oh, you mean this? My life, I shouldn't be living it just for my own self-pleasure and interests. Oh, I should be living my life submitting to God and taking his interests and putting them above my own. I don't want to do that, so I'm not going to give the facts a good consideration."
That's right, Dr. Mike. I mean, facts are still very important. But I call this. I'm also curious to ask you this question also, Dr. Mike, because I've read a book. I'm reading a book lately by, I'm not sure if you heard the name of Dr. Rebecca McLaughlin. She wrote a book entitled "Confronting Christianity: 12 Hard Questions to the World's Largest Religion." Dr. Rebecca she earned her Ph.D. from Cambridge, and she's also contributing to the Gospel Coalition. And she presented a data about the future of Christianity, that Christianity will be, well, particularly Christianity in China, will be full blown. I mean, there are going to be more Christians in China than in the U.S. in the year 2060 onwards. I'm not sure with your opinion, Dr. Mike, considering the status of the church right now, what do you think is the church doing right now? How's the church performing today? And what do you think is the future of Christianity?
Well, the future of Christianity, if the New Testament is correct and Jesus' teaching is correct, it's very good. We know how it ends. We know how things end. We know how the last chapter, what happens in it. But the state of the church today, I think that depends on where you are in the world. In places like China and Iran and India, it's growing, and despite the attempts of the government to stop it, it is growing. And throughout the history of the church, it has often been the case that the blood of the martyrs serves as the seed for the church to grow, and it will probably continue that way. I fear for my brothers and sisters in Christ in China and Hong Kong and India, because they are being persecuted terribly, and they're facing or at least many of them are. India, it's getting worse for many Christians over there. The current president says he wants to rid the country of all Christians and get rid of Christianity. China, It's difficult to be a real Christian. You have to, with the new laws that are over there right now, that you have to submit to the communist government and can't speak against it. And they don't want you meeting as a church, except with the officially approved. And you can go to prison for life for disobeying this. So Christians in Hong Kong and China are facing terrible decisions right now. Very real life. This is happening right now. I mean, if for many, they have to choose freedom or whether they're going to follow Christ. And that's difficult. So, but the church will probably continue to grow faster and exponentially because of this in China and in India and in Iran and in other countries. I know it's growing in Indonesia, what my Indonesian brothers and sisters are telling me. It's very much growing in Indonesia, the largest populated Muslim populated country in the world. So the church is growing, and it's fairly strong, and will probably get stronger in many of these countries where it is not convenient to be a Christian. In other countries, such as here in the West, in the US, in Europe, in Scandinavia, it's dark, and the church, much of the church, is weak. And I think that this goes to what Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount in chapter 5 of Matthew. He says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those. Blessed are you when they slander you and persecute you and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward in heaven is great." But that's not happening in the United States because there isn't so much persecution, at least right now. There has been some, and it's been light. Like, for example, here in the US, until recently, unless you allowed atheists and LGBTQ to serve on the leadership committee of an evangelical Christian campus ministry, many colleges in, say, Michigan and California and others, they would not let you be an approved ministry on campus. They kicked you off campus. Fortunately, President Trump has been appointing federal judges that are conservative, and so therefore some of these, he's about 200 of them here in the U.S., more than any other president has done. And so when now these Christian campus ministries are suing the state university that are kicking them off campus. I mean, if you're a private Christian, if you're a private college, a private university, you have the right to tell the Christian group, you can't be here unless you do such and such, okay? If you're private. But if you are accepting government funds, or if you are a state university, you do not have that right to discriminate against Christians for their beliefs. So fortunately, some of the Christian ministries like Ratio Christi and others have sued some of these universities and have won in court because of the conservative justices who are following the U.S. Constitution of our First Amendment, a freedom of speech and a freedom of religion here. And that's why I think it's important that President Trump be reelected too, so that he can continue to appoint these federal judges and perhaps even another Supreme Court justice. I think that's the most important thing that the president will do above other things.
Wow, Dr. Mike, that's a shocking news that you just shared about what has been going on lately with the church there in the U.S. And it seems that, as what you said, the effect of not so much persecution as in China and India and the Middle East, people are sleeping. And as what you said, so far President Trump is.
Let me jump in here real quick, Carl.
Sure.
Sleeping is a very good metaphor that you use. I think it's a very accurate one. The church in West, here in the U.S. and in Europe, is sleeping, and it's because we've prospered, not as a church, but as a nation. And those of us who live in the West, we've got pretty good lifestyles, pretty good health care, pretty good comfort in the way. Even the poor in our countries live better than middle class in a lot of other countries. So the fact that we can live such comfortable lives, it takes our thoughts away from God and puts it more on comfort and how can we get more. And we're thinking about the things here on earth rather than God's kingdom. That's why Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount, blessed are the poor in spirit. And in Luke's version, blessed are the poor, because they're dependent on God for their daily bread. They are thinking more about God. Riches can be kind of a curse to one's walk with God, because now you're just enjoying this life, and the comforts of this life, rather than really thinking about God and what his desires are and his intents and objectives for this world is, and bringing goodness. We think more about ourselves than God, and that's bad. That's why I think the church here in the West is, as you would say, it's sleeping.
Yes, and Dr. Mike, do you think that because scholarship they consider the West as a region wherein we focus so much on the individual. We have this ism called individualism, and is it because of that? Well, in addition, culturally speaking, it's a secular region. Do you think that would put more fuel to the to the secular culture, considering that the church right now is sleeping and it's I mean, any thoughts on that, sir? I mean, because you said that about past President Donald Trump, that it's actually a wake-up call so far about with the judges and also with the suing, and it's so sad that that happens, and discrimination still there, racism. I mean, like, please unpack it for the viewers. I mean, what do you think? Rather, with that question in mind, what do you think also should the church do as a response to that?
I'm not sure how to answer that, Carl, but I mean, the church should certainly be involved in social things. And, I think when social injustice is done, when it occurs, the church should be speaking up and saying things. I'm very happy to see that Andy Stanley, who has a church here near where I live, Andy Stanley and other prominent Christian leaders have spoken out against some of the racial injustice that has been done. Like here in Georgia, early, I think it might have
Dr.
been
Mike,
last year.
I've heard of the because we all know of George, right? I mean, the one who's the
George Floyd.
yeah, yeah. I mean, George Floyd, Black
Yeah.
Lives Matter. I mean, that's sad riot, and is it still going on until now?
Oh yeah, it's still going on,
Sad.
and that's bad. And I think, the peaceful protests, I think they're fine, but then you've got a lot of thugs, people with criminal intent. They're not so much concerned with the racial injustice. They just want to cause trouble. And a lot of them are Marxist. And in fact, the Black Lives Matter leadership has admitted to being Marxist, and that they want to do away with the nuclear family. They want to do away with the traditional family. They want it gone. Not killing the families, but they want to kill the concept of the traditional family. And you have things that are undermining traditional things, like, living a disciplined life, that you're trying to, to succeed, work hard and succeed. That's almost a bad thing now here in the United States. It's better if you fail, and we ought to feel more sorry for these people who make bad decisions and fail, and they're the ones that are the heroes, rather than those who work hard and live disciplined lives and make good decisions. I mean, it's just trying to flip-flop things. It's getting crazy. And when you can't even tell look, I am very empathetic toward those who, for whatever reasons, genetically are born with, male and female genitals and things like that. But, that's in a extreme minority of cases, very few cases. But when you get such widespread now of people who they don't even know whether they're male or female, or they want to identify as something else. I mean, it just shows you how the socially acceptable insanity that our culture has embraced. And notice that it happens the more they're moving away from Christianity and objective morals, then they go into the socially acceptable insanity. That's a danger of rejecting Christianity.
Socially acceptable insanity. I mean, I like how you describe it there. I mean, I would like to go back to that statement you said earlier, that the blood of the martyrs becomes the seed of the future of Christianity, because it always goes back there. I mean, the church right now should step up, because it is the conscience of the state. It is although it doesn't share the same actions and functions. The government is different from the church, yes, but right now, as what you said, I mean, considering these social issues and the sleepiness of the church, it adds more fuel to the engine that will just explode into different pieces. But in addition, there, Dr. Mike, another issue of the church I've noticed so far, because here in the Philippines, it's also the same here. Although the only good thing here is the pandemic has actually caused the church to keep moving, and to give food, money, charity. So that's so far what we've been doing here. And the usual issues here is political, more on political, sir. So there are always going to be times where you're always angry at the government because of this decision making. But sir, what I've also noticed here is there are also divisions that has been occurring in the church also, which is the reason for that is theological differences. So I'm sure we all know of, you've gone through theological backgrounds, studies as well on the different isms of theology, and people are so putting their own convictions into the isms. They're like Calvinism, Arminianism. We're gonna jump. I mean, we're jumping now into the theology. I'm sure we all know that. What are your thoughts on that, Dr. Mike? What should the church actually show unity? How can they show unity from these theological differences?
Yeah, great question. It's something that really just grieves me. And it's something that is not unique to the church today. It's been this way for a very long time. I mean, you go back to Paul's letter to the church at Galatia, and the kind of Galatians chapter 1 that he says, men of James came down and were requiring circumcision of the Gentiles and causing division. And then so they went up to Jerusalem and worked things out. And then it said Peter came down, and these legalists were getting to him there. And Paul says, I had to oppose him to his face, because he was not following what the church in Jerusalem had determined, at which Peter was even present. So you had these kinds of divisions in the early church. Of course, they were able to work through these things. But then later on, I think it's the 4th century, it's the 3rd or 4th century, you have the final historian, Roman historian. His name was Annianus Marcellinus. And so he had been through the brutalities of Rome and how they treated their enemies and anyone who resisted the Romans. Ammianus Marcellinus had seen this stuff. And in contrast, he had seen how the Christians had treated others. And so in this final Roman history, he writes, no wild beast is of such dangerous enemy to man as Christians are to one another. And what a sad testimony from a non-believer saying that Christians, there weren't even any ferocious animals that were as much an enemy to humans as Christians are to one another because of theological disputes. And then you come to, look, I'm a Protestant, but you got to the point where the Catholics were martyring Protestants, and Protestants martyring Catholics. I mean, really? You're going to kill one another? And a lot of times the way that they martyred these Catholics martyred Protestants, Protestants martyring Catholics, they were brutal. What is that about treating your fellow brother in Christ? And then today we get into these discussions over not fundamental issues, such as, the deity of Jesus, his resurrection, and things like this. We get over these knockout, drag, want to destroy someone because they don't agree with you on a secondary or a tertiary issue, such as inerrancy or eschatology, or whether the gifts of the Spirit are for today, and things like that. That is not love. That is something that it grieves God. We know it grieves God because he talks about, loving one another. We can disagree. We can strongly disagree, but we shouldn't be, it should be done in love and done in a manner that builds up the body of Christ rather than causing division. And I grieve when I see this kind of stuff.
Yes, Dr. Mike. We share the same sentiments. Actually, I mean, it's so sad that in reality, not only today, but also as what you mentioned throughout history, and you mentioned one Roman non-Christian, right? Non-Christian Roman, who's a Roman writer. He's Marcellinus, if I'm right. Marcellinus, right?
Yep.
I mean, it simply shows that even in their early times, there was already a tendency that there is going to be division within that community, within the church, and it's so sad that that is also one of the causes of division. So with that, Dr. Mike, what do you think is the well, we're in the topic of apologetics and history. So as a means of apologetics, I think it also applies within the church. So what do you think should the church do in order to somehow ease the pressure or minimize this, or or somehow not actually bring division but promote unity? What are some of your thoughts?
Well, I think it's going to take some mature leadership to do that, and to put an emphasis on unity in the body of Christ. Unfortunately, I think what's needed is persecution, because if you're in a prison cell and you're going to be executed the next day, and because you're a believer, and if you're a Calvinist and the cell is being shared by a Molinist and an Arminian, and all three of you are going to be executed the next day for being Christian, you're not going to be involved in arguments and name calling because of your theological difference on that tertiary issue that night. And if the church gets persecuted for being a Christian, you're against certain things, and you're going to worship and you're going to promote the gospel no matter what, and now people are being thrown in prison, they're getting their property confiscated. The real Christians are going to, they're going to be the ones that are making things happen. With a lot of people who claim to be Christians now, I think we're going to find that they're not. They're going to walk away because their faith is weak. They're not really concerned about these things. And at time when it's persecuted, then believers are going to start focusing on what really matters theologically. They got too much time on their hands if they're promoting division and over arguing on social media and everything over all these different theological disputes.
Yes, Dr. Mike. That's a very, I can see it's really straight from the heart there that you said. You're so passionate in saying that you grieve for the church. And then right now I completely agree what you said, persecution. You said it so passionately that we really need persecution. And I like your illustration. Wherein
we don't want it, but we need it probably.
Oh yes, I mean, we don't want it, but we need it. Yes, but I mean, I like your illustration. From a Molinist, a Calvinist, and an Arminianist in one cell, and then knowing that you'll be executed the following day, you would not go into arguments. You would, love one another, and encourage one another, and pray with one another for hope. And I mean, I believe we're nearing the times, and it's well, our persecution right now is the virus, and also the social issues going on also around the globe, not only the US, because I've been hearing also riots from different parts of the globe, and I believe
There's definitely
it's
riots over
getting
here. Yeah.
yes.
But I think that the real riots are probably not being caused mainly by those working for social justice. I think it's probably by Marxists and anarchists who are trying to topple the government and change things so that we're no longer a free country. I think that's probably who is really causing the problems over here.
Yes. I like when you said Marxist because in the university where I'm studying, we have a lot of Marxists in our
Mm.
university, and a lot of protests also because our university is a state university, and I always notice there from the open field there are always people there, raising their placards. I cannot I cannot judge easily that they are Marxists, but I've talked to many of them promoting that ideology of Marxism, and it's so crazy to me because I mean it's so funny if you look at it because we all know the foundations of Marxists, the Communist Manifesto, the Das Kapital, but then they try to remove that and make Marxist a really good ideology. I mean, I'll just segue on that, sir. I just want to hear your thoughts on Marxism. Do you think it's a good for the society? It's
You're
something
right.
good for the society.
Something they are protesting within a free society because they want Marxism. But I would be interested in seeing if they can give an example of a country that's Marxist where there's freedom.
Yes.
So if a person loves freedom, they don't want Marxism. Capitalism has its problems. It is not perfect, of course. And in a capitalist country, a free country, you work toward continuously to getting a balance. And when you see social injustice, you got to point it out and you got to work to eliminate that social injustice. Look, people are going to be racist. You're never going to abolish racism totally. There's always going to be racist. Here in the US, there are going to be whites who hate blacks. There are going to be blacks who hate whites. Blacks hate Asians and things like this. You're just gonna hate. You're gonna find this, and it's Christians. It should never ever be tolerated in the church. We can't really do too much with society, right? But we can do it in the church, and we can show an example how whether you're Jew, Gentile, barbarian, Scythian, slave, free man, whoever you are, your brother and sister in Christ, if you are following Jesus. And at the foot of the cross, there is equality, and there should be no racism or discrimination. And for a Christian to be a racist is ungodly. It's sinful. We need to be to be an example of that to the non-believers, and we need to stand up for justice of every kind, not only racial justice, but justice of every kind. But the kind of things that we're seeing over here, at least in the States, where conservative voices are trying to be silenced, where freedom is being really challenged right now with Marxism. If you want to remain free, you can't take Marxism, that's for sure.
Yes, Dr. Mike. Well, that seals the deal with this particular issue on social issues and fractures in the church. That truly, we need is mature leadership. We need love. We need the persecution. At the same time, Jesus Christ, the gospel itself, at the center of the church. But in relation, going back to the what we're discussing on apologetics and history, I wanna have this test, just test ride. I'm gonna ask this what atheists commonly ask, and I want to hear maybe how can you answer these questions, Dr. Mike. Would that be okay, sir?
Sure.
All right,
I have
sir.
a little more time.
All right, good. All right, so the atheists raise these numerous objections to Christianity, and one of them is how you answer it. How you will answer it. Hopefully, you viewers would also observe how Dr. Mike here exchange here, because it's very important that the church also know how to respond to these questions. And one of the question here is, sir, is isn't there enough evidence for Christianity? Like it's so, yeah, Christianity is broad, but come on, like there's contradictions in the Bible. I mean, like in the, if you look at the Bible, there are different there are verses that doesn't have to be there, and there's not enough evidence for Christianity, in meaning that there are numerous uh, corruptions of manuscripts throughout this centuries. And they would raise these questions, Dr.
Yeah.
Mike. I wonder how would you respond to that?
Well, in terms of the corruption of manuscripts, yeah, there's some corruptions in manuscripts, but using the science and discipline of textual criticism, we can get back to a text of the New Testament, which is essentially what was originally written. So, and this kind of textual criticism, this applies to all ancient literature, okay? So the reason we have so many differences in the manuscripts is because we have so many manuscripts. So we have approximately 5,500 Greek manuscripts of our New Testament today. If you want to look at something like Suetonius and what he's most famous for, his Lives of the Caesars, of the 12 Caesars, we have over 200 manuscripts of that. However, they all derive from a single manuscript that they copied from in the 9th century. So all of those 200 plus manuscripts can be traced back to a single manuscript to the 9th century. That's what they have. Tacitus, they basically have one manuscript for, I think, his Annals of Rome, books 1 through 6. And then you have 7 through 10, which are missing. And then you have one manuscript that have for 11 through 16. And this manuscript, I think, is likewise dated to the middle of the 9th century. And Tacitus and Suetonius wrote in the beginning of the 2nd century, just a few decades after John's Gospel. When you look at Cicero's letters, 1st century BC, second half of the 1st century BC, we have one really good manuscript that was written somewhere between 10 to 100 years later. But after that, most of them are written hundreds of years later. Plutarch's Lives. Plutarch is our greatest ancient biographer. Yeah, there's a few early fragments. One fragment written within 100 years of Plutarch's originals. But the rest of them, almost all of them, between the 9th and 15th centuries. 9th and 15th centuries, that's 700 years minimum afterward. But with our New Testament, we've got so much better. So anyway, because we have so many manuscripts and good manuscripts, we can get back to a text which is essentially what was originally written. We can have a lot more confidence in that than we can with the text of Suetonius and Tacitus and many of the others. In terms of contradictions, I've written a book on this, but there are a number of things that we can talk about. If there's one thing that I can give to someone to remember, two things would be, number one, if Jesus rose from the dead, Christianity is true, period. And it would remain true even if there are contradictions and errors in the Gospels, okay? Jesus rose from the dead, Christianity is true, period. Second, if you have some contradictions, at the very worst, this does away with some ways of understanding biblical inerrancy. But that's pretty much it. Well, at least given the kinds of differences that we have in the Gospels. I mean, there's nothing like the tomb was empty, the tomb was not empty. Jesus died, Jesus did not die. Jesus rose from the dead, Jesus did not rise from the dead. Jesus walked on water, Jesus did not walk on water, he sank. We don't have those kinds of discrepancies in the Gospels. The kinds of discrepancies we have are no different than the kind that you find in other ancient literature, such as if you were to look at the assassination of Julius Caesar, as described by Appian, Cicero, Dio Livy, Nicolaus, Plutarch, Suetonius, and Velleius. I mean, the kinds of discrepancies between the assassination of Caesar, about the same kinds of things and the same sort of discrepancies we have in the resurrection narratives. But that doesn't mean that we can't know the gist of what happened. So I just don't find these kinds of objections to be very persuasive.
Oh, Dr. Mike, I like how you said it there, that it's completely a period when Christ is resurrected. It's Christianity is true, because that is the central claim, right? That's the center of Christianity. I just want to clarify, Dr. Mike, how many, if you, I'm sure you deal with a lot of manuscripts. If we gather all the manuscripts around the world from different various museums, both Old and New Testament, throughout space and time, how many of them are
Oh,
there
I
in
don't
the
know.
present?
I can't speak for the Old Testament,
Again,
but I can tell you that the kind of manuscript evidence we have for the Old Testament is much less than what we have for the New Testament. The original text of the New Testament, we have gotten a whole lot closer to that. At least we can have a whole lot more confidence that what we are reading with our New Testament, we can have a whole lot more confidence that what we are reading is close to what the original said, more confidence than we can with the Old Testament. So I can't speak with the Old Testament.
so with the New
But
Testament, how many are there? I mean, in total.
nobody's really counted them all. I've asked Dan Wallace about this. In fact, we'll be posting a video within the next 2 weeks with Dan Wallace and I discussing these things. But Dan says that, you have roughly 5,500 Greek manuscripts, somewhere between 12 and 15 of them being composed within by the end of the 2nd century, beginning of the 3rd century. So you're looking at, within 200 years of the autographs of the originals, we've got somewhere between 12 and 15. Well, no, not 200, about 150 years. I'd say within 200 years of Jesus, but about within 150 years, we have between 12 and 15 manuscripts.
Wow.
That's pretty amazing.
Yeah,
And then
close.
Dan said, I think he said, we have at least 10,000 manuscripts in other languages like Syriac and Coptic, which are very important, and other languages. So we've got a lot, plus you've got quotations from the patristics, the early church fathers, and sometimes they paraphrase, sometimes they're recalling from memory and things like this. So they're not always going to be verbatim. Sometimes they are very close to being verbatim. But yeah, so you got all these kinds of, you got translations, you got quotes in the early church fathers, and you have early Greek manuscripts.
Going now to Jesus, Dr. Mike, there are these certain objections of atheists wherein Jesus, what happened to him? He was born from a virgin, and he died he died, and on the 3rd day he rose again. That pattern is shared by other historical gods like Krishna. Um,
Well, actually, it
yeah.
isn't by Krishna. Krishna did not have a resurrection. There have been people like Acharya S. in her book, The Christ Conspiracy, the greatest story ever sold. And I wrote a lengthy review of that, and in which I even included some comments that I got from a leading Buddhist scholar, a leading Hindu scholar. And they say, a lot of these alleged parallels with Krishna and Buddha are just spurious. They were invented. It never happened. And they can't point to an original source for this. Now, that's not to say you can't find some parallels in some other figures. So, for example, you have Dionysus. I believe he was the offspring of Zeus, that he is said to have created wine. Okay. And then you have Thor, whose life was threatened at birth. And I think Dionysus is one that is said to be born of a virgin, but really, no, he came out of a rock. Is that a virgin? But you can find certain parallels. There was a guy named Asclepius. Maybe it's based on a historical figure. We just don't know. But Asclepius is known to be a healer. Maybe even having raised someone from the dead. Closer to Jesus' time, you've got Apollonius of Tyana, who lived in the 1st century, and he was a traveling itinerant philosopher, and he is said to have done some miracles. And there are conflicting reports that are mentioned by Philostratus in his Life of Apollonius of Tyana. Some say that he died, some say he did not die, some say he came back from the dead and was seen. Like he mentions one time account of one of Apollonius's disciples. Now, Philostratus is writing about 100 years, 125 years after Apollonius' death. So we don't know if this was an original disciple or someone who lived decades later, but this disciple was with some other disciples in a room, and this one disciple was sleeping, and he woke up. He said that Apollonius had appeared to him in a dream. Did anyone else see him? And nobody else did. And that was considered, the resurrection appearance of Apollonius. So what you have to do, and then Hercules, or Heracles in Greek, he was a hero. And then when he was diminishing in his power and was kind of sickly, he built a large fire, jumped into it, and someone said that he ascended to heaven on the horse Pegasus. So so he commits suicide and he ascends to heaven on the horse Pegasus. What skeptics like to do is just say, well, he ascended to heaven, forget the suicide, forget the Pegasus horse. But so what they do is they take all these different figures that are peppered over maybe 1,000 years or even more, and they combine them into a single composite figure, and that's similar to Jesus in some ways. And that would be the same. I have to give some American examples, not Filipino. You could think of your own for over there, but it would be like a present historian saying, all right, let's take Abraham Lincoln, who was a tall, lanky Illinois senator who got elected to 2 terms as president, and let's take John F. Kennedy, who was graduated from Harvard, became president, and then let's take the fictional character David Palmer, who played the first Black U.S. president in the television series 24. And let's combine all 3 of these figures, and what do you get? Barack Obama, a tall, lanky Illinois senator who became the first Black U.S. president, and he graduated from Harvard. And of course, so therefore Barack Obama never existed, or the story about Barack Obama was invented. And of course they'd say, well, that's really lame, but that's exactly what skeptics are doing in appealing to these similarities in other ancient figures.
Wow, that's I mean, that's sad, I mean, and they're historians.
Well, let's be let me be clear here.
Yes.
There aren't really many professional historians who are making such claims. In fact, and in fact, you'd be hard pressed to find a professional historian, a scholar in a relevant field, who's trained in this area, who would say that the Christians copied off of these others.
Yeah. It's like Dr. Mike. It's like if only a historian would be serious with his job as an historian, he would not make such claims. He would not believe in this. He would not use this against that Jesus really is doing this. Because in your
you'll find a few. I mean, there's maybe a handful around the world, okay, but there's not many of them.
Yes, but Dr. Mike,
and they're not highly regarded at all by other historians.
Not regarded. I mean, imagine they studied in a really prestigious university, and then they produce this kind of spurious explanation.
Wonders how good their education was at those universities.
Dr. Mike, what sources would you recommend in regarding this topic on Jesus and the alleged parallels?
The alleged what?
The parallels? Yeah, the parallels.
Okay. Well, there is, I've done some videos on this, so they could go to my YouTube channel. So just go to YouTube, type in my name, Mike Licona, Licona.
Subscribe to his channel, guys.
Subscribe, click the notifications so that you can receive some stuff and updates. And I've got a long lecture on there. Did the early Christians borrow from pagan myths? I think it's called. That's like a 45-minute lecture, and then there's also, I think there's a Q&A to that. Maybe not on that one. So I've got a 45-minute lecture there, and then I have maybe a 5 or 7 minute short video on it on my YouTube channel as well. I forgot what it's called. It might have been Did Christians Borrow, or Were There Pagan Parallels, or something like that. And that was produced just a couple of months ago, that short one. So there's some things like that. There's a book, the name of it eludes me at this point, but you probably, let me see if I can find it real quick on Amazon. It's by Joe Mulvihill. Mulvihill.
Mulvihill.
He's the author, and it's Joe. I don't know if he has Joe or Joseph. I'm seeing some cartoon stuff coming up, and that's, of course, that's not it.
Yeah.
Joe, it's EPH Mulvihill. Yeah, I don't know why these things are coming up. But he did his doctoral dissertation on the subject, and did a fantastic job where he's looking at different pagan parallels. Okay, so that can be consulted. Lee Strobel, in his book In Defense of Jesus, he interviewed me in there, and he interviewed Edwin Yamauchi, and we both touch on this. So there's some chapters in that book about it. I'd say probably Joe's book is going to be probably the best, most informative on this. Then there's a book. Let's see if I've got it.
Yeah, you have a lot of tons of books there.
Well, it's somewhere on all my shelves here. Oh, it's probably over there. It's called The Riddle of Resurrection, and it's by T.N.D. Mettinger, Mettinger, The Riddle of Resurrection. And he's a Swedish scholar. And I think it was 2001, he wrote a monograph. It's kind of expensive, maybe $60 on where you can order it. It's an academic monograph. And he actually takes a contrary position. He thinks that there are 3 and perhaps as many as 5 dying and rising gods in the ancient Near East that predate Jesus. He does admit that there's a consensus of scholars today that says there are none. But he's a very careful scholar, and he says he thinks there are 3, perhaps 5. He is cautious, and I admire his scholarship. I mean, he acknowledges that he may be wrong, but in the end, then he tries to compare it with Jesus, and he says, well, the things is all of these others that I've cited from the ancient Near East, their death and coming back to life are tied to the agricultural cycles from, the dry season to the rainy season. And he says these were fictitious characters who lived in the distant, unnamed past, whereas Jesus, was a historical character who had lived within only a few decades of when reports of him were being written, and has nothing to do with the agricultural cycles. Wow. And he says, no, these people claim to be eyewitnesses of this. He says, it is very different from these other parallels. And he goes on and he says, the riddle remains. So,
Interesting. That's good.
Yeah, it's an academic, so it's going to be very dry reading for a lot of people unless you're used to this kind of writing, but it's a very good book. That would be someone who does a very careful analysis, and he comes to the conclusion there are a few, and I think he may be right on some of these, but that doesn't mean the Christians borrowed from them any more than the fact that there were fictitious stories of shipwrecks in ancient novels means that the story of the Titanic was invented. You just don't get to that because there are some similarities. You can find similarities in just about anything.
Yes. Interesting, Dr. Mike. We're going to note that. A few viewers will consider that as well. Second to the last objection, and then we're done. Miracles. What are your thoughts on miracles? Like, I just don't believe in miracles.
They happen. They happen. And, skeptics will say, they'll appeal to Ernst Troeltsch's principle of analogy says, look, they don't happen today, therefore they didn't happen in the past because nature acts in the same way. But there are many cases, credible cases of miracles happening today. And so we could turn the principle of analogy on its head and said, because they happen today and things are the same nature in antiquity as they are today, then at least in the laws of nature, because miracles do happen today, then they certainly could have happened in the past. I don't find any of the objections against miracles to be persuasive in the least. I think they're based on an atheistic worldview that just simply is out of touch with reality. When you look at things such as well-evidenced near-death experiences, veridical apparitions of the dead, extreme answered prayer, and numerous instances of well-attested paranormal phenomena, I think the evidence for a supernatural component, a spiritual dimension of reality, I think the evidence is so persuasive that if you take a look at it and still remain an atheist, you at least can't claim to be a realist today. If you deny it based on all the evidence that's out there and all this kind of stuff, the evidence for a supernatural dimension of reality sets a really good background that increases the plausibility of miracles. And when it comes to, say, the miracles of Jesus, these are some of the best attested things about Jesus. They appear in early sources, multiple independent sources. They're even attested by Josephus, an unsympathetic source, who acknowledges that Jesus did amazing deeds. He doesn't call them miracles, but the term he uses for, I think it's paradoxa, the Greek term that he uses
Paradox.
for miracles.
I know. I heard like baffling deeds, something.
Yeah, that's what it
Baffling.
means. But it's the same thing that he uses of, I think, the miracles of Elijah. So the same term. So, but anyway, here you would have a non-Christian, someone who's a historian who's unsympathetic to the Christian cause. And he acknowledges that Jesus did deeds that astonished crowds. So, so the majority of historians of Jesus, even atheists and agnostics, and it's pretty much a consensus. As far as I know, Bart Ehrman is the only one in print who denies it. But every other historian of Jesus will say that Jesus, we can know about him that he performed extraordinary deeds that were interpreted as miracles and exorcisms. Now, the skeptical ones of course, aren't going to say they were divine miracles and exorcisms, but they will acknowledge that he did extraordinary, astonishing deeds that were interpreted as divine miracles and exorcisms.
Maybe a wonderful source there would be the wonderful, amazing work of Craig Keener, Miracles.
Yeah, now that'd be an outstanding. The 2-volume set by Craig Keener on Miracles is outstanding.
Yes, and I believe na if in case na you can't afford the book, Craig Keener actually presented this. I think it was in the YouTube channel entitled I think Biology University. I think it's in the YouTube channel. You guys can check it out. Last objection, Dr. Mike. This is a wonderful session. I'm learning a lot as we speak. And by the way, you viewers, if you want to know more about history, more expounded on the discipline of history, you can go to our Q&A session with Brother Irvin Bugtong. The topic is on relieving Christianity in the early church. You can go to our archives. You can go to our video section, the Facebook page, and you can just scroll down, look for that name. Last objection, Dr. Mike, is should we take the Bible literally or figuratively? Like, consider Genesis and consider the parables of Jesus and these things. I mean, is it literally, figuratively, or Genesis?
The answer is yes.
Crazy. Yes.
You have to take them. Yeah, you take some things figuratively. You take some things literally. Of course, you want to take a parable in a figurative sense, right? Because that's the way it was meant. You take Psalms and Proverbs in a figurative sense. Many scholars think that Revelation should be taken in a figurative sense. Certainly, when it talks about, I think it's the Revelation 7 or 12, where it talks about the great dragon with a red head or 7 heads. Red dragon with 7 heads, whose tail will sweep a third of the stars in the universe down to the earth. And then later identifies that as Satan. We're not to think of this cosmic space monster hovering out there in the cosmos. A lot of things are meant to be taken figuratively. Now, sometimes we cannot, it's difficult to distinguish what is being said here. William Lane Craig has done a lot of work in recent years on how to interpret the first 11 chapters of Genesis. John Walton at Wheaton has written on this, The Lost World of Genesis as well. He takes a different view than Craig.
Yes. I'm aware of that book because especially with the idea that if it's a global flood or a local flood.
Yeah.
And
And that's different how you interpret the flood like that. But with Genesis, how are we to interpret that? I mean, even the J.I. Packer, who just went on to be with Jesus last month, um,
oh,
he has said publicly, and he said it to me, Dan Wallace, Greg Minette privately, that he was open to theistic evolution. He doesn't know if theistic evolution was true. He didn't really have a position on it. But he has also said what makes it difficult is he said, like the trees of the knowledge of good and evil and of knowledge of good and evil and the tree of life in Genesis. He said trees were often used as poetic symbols in ancient literature of that time. So were there such trees like this in the garden? He says, I don't know. And he said, did Eve actually speak to a serpent in the garden? He says, I don't know. So here you've got a guy, one of the most conservative evangelicals out there. He was one of the three scholars who crafted the Chicago Statement on Biblical Inerrancy. And he's saying, I don't know, I don't know what we're supposed to take in the creation account as being literal. And so sometimes it's difficult. I look at the portents that appear at Jesus' death, things like the darkness, the temple veil splitting, the earthquake, especially the saints that Matthew says were raised when Jesus died. Are these to be taken literally? These kinds of phenomena are mentioned in the Greco-Roman and Jewish literature on a fairly regular basis. So were they meant to be interpreted literally, or were they special effects? Is it something like we would say today that when the planes crashed in the World Trade Center building on 9/11, that was an earth-shaking event? We're not meaning to communicate that an earthquake happened that day. We have or when we say about, a person who was really hungry and ordered more food than they ended up eating, their eyes were bigger than their stomach. We've got sayings like this. Well, did they use sayings like this in antiquity? And so some of these things are just really difficult for us to discern at times. I'll give you one more example. Things like when Jesus says, if your right eye makes you sin, rip it out and throw it from you. Well, there is nothing in the text that would suggest that we are to take that in anything other than a literal way. Because it says it's better.
I'll get my scissors right.
Yeah.
Gouge my eye out.
It's tough. I mean, if we took that literally, then all of us would be blinded. But why don't we take it literally? Because Jesus says it is better for you to lose one of your body parts than for your entire body to be thrown into hell. So why is it that we don't take that literally? And if you ask the average person about that, they'll, well, come up with all kinds of reasons, but they're not good reasons.
Yeah.
Oh, I can give you one though. We should, because it appears to have been rhetoric, common rhetoric of that. There's a guy named Seneca who was considered to be
Stoic?
perhaps that's the Stoic philosopher, right?
Stoic philosopher.
Perhaps the most brilliant Roman mind in the first century. And Seneca said, if your heart is evil, tear it out.
Oh.
Now, I think that there is, of course, he's not meaning that literally because that would kill you. But we find Paul saying something like, put to death the members of your body, mortal body, or regard them as being dead. Why? Regard your heart as being dead if it's wicked. Why? Because a dead heart doesn't hate. If you're blind, you don't lust. So consider when you're tempted to look on a woman, to lust for her, consider yourself to be blind, because at that point, if you're blind, you don't have an eye to look at that woman. So these are the kinds of things, and I think that's what Jesus was saying. He was using this hyperbolic shock language that he uses elsewhere. Unless you hate your father, mother, brother, sister, wife, and children, you can't be my disciple. Matthew rephrases that. He paraphrases that and takes away the shock and the rhetoric and says, unless you love me more than father, mother, brother, sister, wife, and children, you can't be my disciple.
Wow.
So we have to be aware of ancient rhetoric, which is different then than it is today. And if we're not, you could end up, doing some in the early church performed self-castration because they interpreted some of the sayings of Jesus in a literal sense. And it's like hermeneutical errors can have tragic consequences.
Man, I like that. Doctor. Amazing. I mean, I like one question also. One I don't know. I mean, a funny question is if Jesus thought that you when if you think your body parts are causing you to sin, remove it or even remove your eyes. Why didn't he remove his own eyes and remove his own his own
Well, you say,
body
but
parts as
if
well?
he was sinless, he wouldn't need to, right?
Yes, but they would say also that he's human and there's so much stopping him from so
Yeah.
from fulfilling his the prophecies. So, yeah, I was like thinking
But
that
of course, we're not aware of any of his disciples doing those things either, right?
yes, exactly. Also, his disciples didn't do such things. I like what you said there in the first part about Genesis, wherein you cited J.I. Packer and even the conservative evangelicals who say that I don't know. I believe we can consider we don't know it in terms of certainty, but we can consider it as simply theoretical. Like we can consider just the theories of the interpretation, theoretical interpretations of Genesis, which actually is to me it's actually good because it also activates your wonder and your imagination. I mean to see how the world really looks like back then because it really looked different back then even during
Yeah.
the
There's
during the
certainly an otherness
pre-flood.
to the past, right? There's an otherness to the past.
Yeah, there's
It's
an
foreign to us.
yes
We
because
are far
I've
removed.
I'm not sure, Dr. Mate, if you heard of the idea wherein there used to be an ancient intelligent civilization back then that is not as primitive as what mainstream historians would teach in their universities. That actually, judging by the archaeological findings, there's actually ancient civilizations that wasn't in the textbooks or in the books of the scholars or even taught in universities that actually shows us that people were really uh, they had this high value in precision and tools and skills back then, even way before, even way better than how humans build things right now. I mean that's very interesting. The pre-flood world is it has to be
Hmm.
something very well. Yeah, it's theoretical, but there are this until now this dug up on-site archaeological sites that until now they still do not cannot understand, like the Pyramid of Giza, the Stonehenge, the Easter Island heads. I mean, this is very interesting to make a page to do PhD, right, Dr. Mike, for future historians.
Yeah, for those who'd be interested in studying that stuff, it probably, you could do a dissertation. That's not going to give you a full answer, though, I'm sure.
Yes, that won't give a full answer, but rather a like a simple skeleton or like a theoretical dissertation to show it. And another case also wherein people used to be monotheistic back then, and then they degraded to polytheism. Those are the things so far, Dr. Mike, that I've been interesting to study so far, because I've been always been taught we're in Sumeria, Mesopotamia, and they all started polytheistic. But there's actually more data that are valuable that speaks that monotheism was the first ism, and then it branched out to polytheism, rather degraded. So historians would look at history like going upward. That we are, as time goes by, we're becoming smarter, stronger, and then soon we'll be conquering the outer space. But actually, if you look at the other counter, the counter perspective of that, it's actually downward. I mean, people before uh, not only morally, but also in terms of the knowledge that they had before, it was lost. And now we're going downward to our own postmodern, post-truth era. So I apologize, viewers, if I segue a little bit, and sorry, Dr. Mike, if I extended there a little bit. But this is very. I would like to really discuss this with you, brother Dr. Mike, in the long run. But because of the lack of time, I would just maybe for the last question, Dr. Mike, I believe the viewers would want to hear what are your uh, encouragements and advices, not only for the church, but also, so one part for the church, for the believers, and I want another part for the non-believers, to make it more open. What are your thoughts? What are your advices and encouragements to them regarding apologetics and history?
terms of Christians, I'd say, look, we have some good evidence for Christianity today. There is no, airtight arguments, but, we look, whether you're a scientist or a historian or a philosopher, we need to be satisfied with what seems most reasonable, where the evidence is pointing most strongly. And I think we as Christians have the evidence on our side. And that's has become more and more the case over probably the last 60 years. As science, especially in astrophysics and also molecular biology, they've come to see what appears to be amazing design. We've got a lot of good evidence that supports the Christian worldview. So just let that encourage you. If you experience doubts at times, then check out the websites or the YouTube channels of those like myself, of William Lane Craig, and many others. They're just out there. In terms of non-believers, look, if you're looking and you want to, if you truly want to embrace the correct worldview, then God bless you, and just keep seeking and be open-minded, and just go where the evidence points. I feel like even as a Christian, if I felt the evidence pointed away from Christianity, I'd be willing to leave, because my greatest fear would be that my biases would keep me from discovering truth, and it cost me eternity. And it's just really important. Truth is really important here. And if this is important to you, I wish you the best on your journey. Just try to be as open-minded as you can and look at the data, the evidence, the arguments from both sides, and choose what you think is the most reasonable one.
Oh, Dr. Mike, that's the last spin in the coffin, I believe. And what a wonderful session we had. I think we've been talking for almost 2 hours already. I think this is the longest video we've made so far, Dr. Mike, in this session. Well, it is expected because we're discussing on history and apologetics. So thank you very much, viewers, for watching us. And we appreciate the Fellowship League. Would like to appreciate Dr. Mike here for not only being our guest here and our amazing historian and scholar, but also brother in Christ. Dr. Mike will continue to pray for your ministry. Please continue to encourage more people and also to spread the truth of the gospel to more people who are in need of the answers to the questions of life, and also questions of history and the Bible as well, especially in apologetics.
You're welcome.
Yes, please continue to like, follow, and share our Facebook page, the Fellowship League. We focus on 3 words: facts, cross, and discourse. Please also subscribe to our YouTube channel, same title, same name, the Fellowship League. Please click the bell button and share our YouTube channel as well for high quality, and also for, I believe, more people would want to hear this. And I hopefully you viewers were touched and also at the same time enlightened by this exchange. Thank you very much for watching us. Catch our Sunday Hangout. And also our next guest next week. You will never know who it is. We'll announce it right away. Thank you very much, guys, for watching. Dr. Mike, it's an honor to see you here. See you again next time. God bless.